I still think that companies also now in the range of 4 or 5 million euros, if they want to scale and grow, M&A is probably the right way.
First, talk about Match.com, a company I don't know anything about.
You would say something, the interpreter, which in this case is like the speech bubble that pops up, is telling you what I've said, and then you can respond.
And welcome to Slater Pod 60, the language industry's favorite weekly podcast. Hi, Esther.
Hello. How you doing?
All good, all good. Today we have a great guest, Britta Aagaard, Chief Business Officer at Semantics. She's based in Denmark, and she's heading Semantics' Language Solutions Unit, which basically is everything except the interpreting part at Semantics. She joined Semantics when she actually sold her company, TextMind, back in 2017 to Semantics and decided to stay on. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation, I'm sure. Hey, today we'll be talking about big tech competing on big language tech, then captioning Zoom, and then Appen disappointed their investors, as competition heats up in the data for AI space. So just briefly dive into those results. But first, talk about Match.com, a company I don't know anything about, buying a Korean company called Hyperconnect, which is a chat tool for a cool $1.7 billion. So why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a lot of money. So Match, for those of you who don't know, and for Florian, who clearly doesn't know, it's a dating platform, but they have multiple brands. So I think they own Tinder and a couple of other ones as well. But they acquired Seoul-based company called Hyperconnect, as you said, for about $1.73 billion, which is a lot of money.
That's
so what Hyperconnect does, so it's not in the dating scene space necessarily, but they basically facilitate conversations, live chat, video conversations between people who speak different languages potentially in different parts of the world. So they have two different apps. They've got one called Azar, which I think is kind of the one that's most relevant, at least to Match. And that is like one-to-one video chats, effectively. And then they've got another one, which is Hakuna, which is
Matate.
for online live broadcasts. But I think the thing that kind of occurred to us, or the thing that sort of stood out to us, was the fact that Hyperconnect, so those two apps are running on Google, and specifically Google's speech to text and translation API.
And it was actually a case study. It's a case study on the Google Cloud website. So they highlighted Hyperconnect as kind of breaking down language barriers, that usual cliche, but it's an interesting case study for Google's really increasing clout in like all things MT. And I think one of the key differentiators here with Hyperconnect is that the language capability. And let's try to unpack it a little bit. But for it's interesting to see a company getting sold for 1.7 billion that at its core runs on like Google's NLP/machine translation offering, which is getting a fair amount of traction. So can we just try to unpack the multilingual aspect of Hyperconnect?
Yeah. Well, so I think in terms of the workflow, you've got video chat. So let's say you and I are talking on video chat, which we are. But if one of us was to start speaking in a different language, then the Google Speech API converts my speech, let's say, into text. It then translates it with Google Translation API, and then Google Messaging sends that back to Azar, so the Hyperconnect app, and it's displayed in a text bubble for the second user, so for you.
So there's no text to speech anymore. So basically, you speak English, I speak German, and then like it would translate to German, and then there's a speech bubble, and so you can we can talk, and then we can read the speech bubble, and so we know what the other person's saying.
Yeah, to me, it's a bit like, what do you call it, relay interpreting or something. Like you would say something, the interpreter, which in this case is like the speech bubble that pops up, is telling is telling you what I've said, and then you can respond, and I will understand what you say. It's kind of in the same vein as the multilingual sort of live captioning stuff, except that it's like it's one-on-one conversations with different language speakers.
I just realized we should probably have downloaded the app and tested it out before doing the pod about it. But let's actually do this afterwards.
That. Yeah, we should totally do that.
We should do that because it seems like, I mean, this is not revolutionary per se. So the UI aspect must be very, very good for them to be selling at that price.
Well, and they say they do like 15 million conversations a day, 15 million matches, they call it, a day. Which is a lot, right? I guess.
That's a lot. Like but I mean, then again, I mean, when you just, I mean, we had Martin on the podcast. Of course, if you just do, for example, the speech to text API isn't perfect. I mean, otherwise YouTube subtitles would be a lot better, for example. So, I mean, there's all of these challenges, but I guess people probably are having less, maybe more basic conversations. I don't know how to put that, but like, I mean, you're not going to do
I think it's people who want to communicate as well. Like you're trying to have a conversation. So if there's something that doesn't seem quite right, you're more likely to say, I don't understand. Can you say it again? Potentially, unless it's a very serious translation error that makes you sound sort of rude or offensive, which you would hope.
Yeah, but wouldn't. Then I guess people are primed that because they know it's being machine translated. So yeah, interesting. So 1.7 million built on Google's translation APIs. Interesting. Moving on to one of the key competitors of Google, Microsoft. I think I might get this wrong, but still going to put it out there. I think they're trying to catch up with Amazon and Google on that batch translation because we ran a story that says they rolled out document translation, and they specifically mentioned LSPs and enterprises as potential customers for anybody who has huge translation volumes and document translation, meaning instead of like, having just basically inputting text or maybe going through an API and inputting text, you can actually translate entire batches of documents. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, of course, kind of the native Microsoft formats, HTML as well, Outlook message, PDF, etc. in 70 plus languages. So Microsoft rolled this out. They're charging $15 per million characters. If I remember correctly, this is roughly in line with other big tech offerings. Okay. If I remember from some of our past coverage. And so users can kind of submit, again, entire batches. It's not coming back instantly. It'll take like 15 to 20 minutes, I think, or maybe, between 5 or 20 minutes. So it's not like synchronous. It's not doing it on the fly. It goes in there, it gets processed, and it comes back in apparently very well formatted, which is obviously a problem with like stuff like PowerPoint and PDF. I want to test first, really, well formatted PDF extraction. I have yet to see
is it a PDF, or is it the InDesign stuff? Like just a full on PDF they're working with.
They say PDF. I guess it's probably an editable PDF. So they say the pain point that made them launch this was well, not that Amazon and Google had this before, which I researched a little bit. So Amazon launched this about a year ago. And Google also appears to offer a batch translation. But the pain point was that they say, quote unquote, users would have to told them that they have to extract textual content from the document, split it into smaller chunks, translate it using Microsoft Service, and merge all of this translated chunks back to reconstructed document. So that was kind of the pain point. They wanted to say, well, why don't you just throw in the entire 500 slide PowerPoint and wait 20 minutes and then it'll come back to you translated, right? So, again, without deep research, I think they are maybe playing a little bit of catch up with Amazon and Google, but generally, the takeaway, again, big tech continues to refine their MT offering across all of the categories. And I think, we're at the moment now that's very, very clear competition with tech savvy LSPs as well. Obviously the big tech guys have huge channels. So, interesting. But, if you're an LSP, you can also build on some of these technologies, which we just saw with HyperConnect, different offering, but you can use it and build on it. Going to captioning again, down under, AI Media announced results for the first half, and you took a quick look at that.
Yes, yeah, I did. So this is their results. Their first half was until December 31st, 2020. So just released the results. They generated about 23 million Australian dollars, which is about 18 million US dollars in the first half. And that was growth of 21% from the previous year. Most of that revenue is services, I don't know, 99% of it, 90%. And that grew about by about 25%. So they did have like a small bit of what they call other revenues, which declined a little bit. And they reported an EBITDA loss of AUD 7 million. So those are the headline figures.
Pause it there for a second. Did they say anything about reversing that loss at some point? To me, it seems that's a big loss. 7 million on $22 million revenue. I know they're public and the stock has, let me just check their stock, but did they say anything about that?
I think they were talking about some of it as being sort of acquisition related, but then also trying to achieve some synergies coming from the tech side.
But no, like it doesn't seem to be a concern at this point.
I mean, it's definitely not something that I saw as being kind of highlighted in any great detail in the prospectus. And I think they were more talking about the kind of customer mix, the shift towards live enterprise settings that they've been doing a lot more of, and talking about the sort of the geographic diversity as well. So like apparently 40% of their revenues come from North America.
Got it. I'm just pulling up the chart. So on our real-time tracker here for Slido Pro members, not doing too well. I mean, they went IPO mid last year.
It's below the IPO.
It's way below. It's like at they IPO'd around 1.3, and they're now at they're trading at about 80. Like 85. So down quite a lot. Interesting that
they sort of are showing all the right signs in a way. If you look at it from a volume perspective, they're talking about the fact that they did 40% more live enterprise minutes in that period. They captioned something like 7.1 million minutes during the period, which again sounds like a lot. I don't know if that's a lot, but it sounds like a lot to me. And they were talking about sort of the pandemic accelerating, obviously, the use of video. So I think they're definitely sort of banking on the fact that the sort of macro tailwinds are there for them.
And did they do, I mean, we had Zoom Boom in the headline, which is nice, but was there something related to Zoom? So they're doing
they were talking about, well, like I said, the fact that video use has accelerated, particularly for education and for business use, and that in turn has led to more demand for captioning. And they said specifically they saw an acceleration of Zoom captioning globally, which obviously they say is going to sort of outlast the pandemic because, in their words, no one will unlearn Zoom. So it's here to stay.
Yeah, I want. We used them for SlidoCon Remote. They were the captioning partner. It worked extremely well for English. It was that approach where somebody would actually re-speak. It was the re-speak captioning. And so you re-speak, and then because it's speech to text, but it's so much trained to that individual's voice that's re-speaking, the result was extremely good. I think for the MT part, they just used Google Translate. So it wasn't...
More Google.
More Google, yeah. What do you think? Are we gonna, like, the Zoom fatigue thing? Is that real? Are we really gonna, like, once this is all over and people can travel again? I think it's here to stay. I mean, maybe not as excessive as it is now, but I will not stop doing these calls.
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't say Zoom specifically. I mean, like in my outside of work life, I'm not particularly using Zoom.
But generally, like video, let's just call video, not Zoom particularly, but like video conferencing, etc. I mean, before that, before the pandemic, it was always kind of like you would almost have to know somebody really well to kind of impose yourself with a video call. Yeah. Right. But now it's kind of the de facto, like the video just pops up and you expect people to have a decent background and like be ready for it. So I guess that won't go away.
Yeah, for business, I think definitely, and maybe people will still be less keen to travel.
And then for personal, you can hang out on Hyperconnect, right?
But then I'm talking to strangers. I'm not talking to my actual friends. Which, yeah.
Oh, okay. So sorry, I really need to revisit that. So this is only for stranger, the ASAR thing? It's just randomly matching?
I think it's like facilitating meetings between people. Not like necessarily romantic meetings, just like, connecting people across the world who want to go and talk to other people and meet people from different backgrounds and things.
All right. Well, one place I will certainly go when this is all over at some point again is Australia, where Appen is headquartered. And, so Appen, the data for AI leader in the space, obviously got a lot of competition from the language industry over the past 2 to 3 years, not to mention Lionbridge that sold the business for over $1 billion. So Appen they've grown. So they've posted 12% growth to $600 million. They're making a lot of money. They're not losing any EBITDA or
Aussie dollars,
losing any money here. Yeah, Aussie dollars,
so
that's right.
So 480 million, I think, US dollars.
Yeah, and then they're making over 100 million Aussie dollars in what they call underlying EBITDA, whatever, things they're adding or normalizing it at. That's up 8%. But investors aren't happy. Stock's down. Let me just check our index there. We got, it's down. Wow. So it started the year at,
they were doing okay, I think, weren't they? Doing quite well.
So basically in March, they started at around, the stock was at around 20, and then it shot up in the middle of the pandemic to over 42, so more than double, but now it's down to 16 again. So talk about volatility.
Yeah.
So that they basically went from like a $5 billion market cap to now like a $2 billion market cap. And
it's all right.
Yeah, it's all right. But it looks like maybe that whole okay. So I think one of the reasons they're saying was its strong Aussie dollar, then some uncertainty in the economic trends. That's kind of generic. Regulatory. I think they also said that the presidential election held back some of the big government contracts they were probably about to close. And then maybe general big tech is, as Andrew Bradenkamp said at SlaterCon Amsterdam, who knows? Maybe the demand for data isn't infinite as the algorithms are getting better. Also, of course, there's competition. We published a report on data for AI. So Appen had a great run as almost like not the sole provider in that space.
Not completely unchallenged, but
but they had a great run, and now like a lot of companies are piling into the space. So I'm sure that's going to make things harder for them.
But they said they haven't seen any change to the competitive space. I think in the investor call.
They said that?
One other competitor. Yeah, I was looking at the notes from the article we're going to be writing. If they are to be
interesting.
Believed, what was said.
Well, you wouldn't tell your investors that like you're seeing this massive influx of new competition into your space, and sometimes you may not be fully aware. Maybe maybe the opportunities may not even get to you. But yeah, I think there's a fair amount of language service providers that didn't compete in that segment at all, but now are. So I do think there's competition. Maybe not in their core client base, but the Googles, the Microsofts, those are kind of their key companies. But in the rest of the industry, that would have gone to Appen, but now isn't going to Appen. Somewhat of a speculative thing here. All right, so let's head over to Denmark and talk to Britta in just 1 second. And welcome back to SlaterPod today with Britta Aagaard, who's the Chief Business Officer at Semantics. Hi, Britta.
Hi, how are you? Hi, Florian. Hi, Esther.
Hi, nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Where are you joining us from today, Britta?
So I'm based in Denmark, and most people only know Copenhagen when you say Denmark, but it's actually in Aarhus. It's the second largest city in Denmark.
All right. Born and raised in Aarhus?
No, actually not. So I'm actually German. So I was born and raised in Germany at the border to Denmark. So this is where it all started.
I did not know that. We need to do a German version of Sledopod at some point.
German language, yeah, there we go.
No, seriously, I should consider that at some point.
I won't be able to co-host, unfortunately.
You can use some AI.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it.
So you don't have a secret language, Florian. So.
I don't have well, I can speak Swiss German and heavily accented Swiss German. All right. So Britta, I introduced you as the Chief Business Officer at Semantics. So Semantics is a Swedish headquartered LSP. And also I said that you joined Semantics actually with the sale of your own company, TextMinded, in 2017.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us a bit more about your background with TextMinded and maybe even further back, like how did you get started in the language industry?
Yeah, exactly. And coming back to where I was brought up, that's exactly what I said, where everything started. So I grew up in the border region between Denmark and Germany, and as in every other, at least European country, there are minorities on both sides of the borders. And in the northern part of Germany, there's a very active Danish-minded minority. And the culture is very much also rooted in the whole educational system. So I have actually Danish ancestors because of historic reasons, but my family as such is German. But my mother decided to send me into a Danish school. So basically, I grew up bilingual. So at home it was German, and school was Danish. And after graduation, I moved to Copenhagen, to Denmark, to study. And I was never supposed to be a translator or in language field. My major was philosophy. And I spent basically the first 15 years of my life after school in academics. However, my field of specialization was philosophy of language, which is still very important and also important part of what I still think I'm doing, even if I left the academics at some point. And without getting too nerdy, so it is really language from a more epistemology point of view. That language is actually the way we understand the world. If we do not have a concept, then we cannot understand whatever reality we think we see. So there's this close correlation between language and knowledge, which still follows me a lot. So I would say, even if I have left everything of that behind, it's still a big part of my vision today. So, especially today, where we talk about AI and data, I still see that essentially at its core, artificial intelligence is language. It's kind of a representation of the world. So I would say I brought my academic background with me, even if I'm a completely different planet today.
What made you leave academia, though, after such a long time, right? And start your company? That's a big step.
It is, and in many ways, story is, should we say, by accident. Being a research fellow wasn't so highly paid. And because I was bilingual, I actually worked as a freelance translator at that point in time, and worked for an agency here in Aarhus, where I live. And they had a huge project that should be done in Trados at that point in time. And they said, can't you come into our office because, that needs to be coordinated. I said, well, I can do that. So that's what I did. And 3 weeks later, the founder and the CEO asked me to stay. And I said, yeah, I would love to stay, but I don't want to translate. That was definitely not my temper, and also not where my passion is. However, what I really like to do is, use my organizational skills. And I could see instantly there's a lot of things that we could do better or different. So moving very fast forward, I was asked to become a partner of that company and invest in the company. It was still quite a small, like €4 million company at that point. And then suddenly and very tragically, the founder and the CEO, who has been really my mentor, he suffered from brain cancer. And within like 12 months, 18 months, he actually died. And he asked me during that time that he wanted me to take over. And again, I said, I can do that. So that's what I did. And already at that time, I could see that I wanted to scale that. I really wanted to do something more with it. And then again, maybe accidentally, at a gala conference in 2011, I met Robert Etches, who had a similar sized company in Denmark as well. And basically after half an hour talk, we said, we need to merge this. Okay. Not because, we need it, but because we really wanted to. Only with all the legal aspects and what have you, 9 months later, we merged our companies and created TextMinded. So from 2012, we then did a few smaller acquisitions also in Denmark and Sweden, and were extremely successful. I mean, we doubled our revenue, we tripled our profits, and then of course suddenly we were interesting also for bigger players out there.
So then you were approached by Semantics around late 2016, I guess, or?
Yeah, actually early, I would say January 2017. So the whole acquisition was really, really fast. It was in a couple of months we did it.
But you decided you needed a bit more time than half an hour than with Robert.
Yeah, but we had that discussion. As I said, we got a lot of interest. We were approached by many companies, also larger American players, in 16 already, and we had this. No, we don't really need that. We can do it on our own, right? And then at some point, we really had a board meeting where we said, no, we don't. We think we should do it on our own. And then, one of our board members said, there's always a number. And what is your number? And if that number is hit, then you also go into these negotiations. And at some point, it just becomes one of the drivers as well. And when you first start and embarking on that idea of actually leaving something behind and embarking into something new, then there's kind of no way back.
Got it. Yeah.
And then tell us a little bit about Semantics then, just a general introduction for those of our listeners who maybe aren't so familiar. Tell us about your areas of focus and some current initiatives.
Yeah, so many who actually know Semantics still know Semantics as a very public sector heavy interpreting company. And this is basically where Semantics come from. In 2015, the current owners of private equity owners of Semantics, they actually bought an interpreting agency and had a huge success with basically supporting immigrant languages for the public sector, whereas translation was, that was a byproduct. That was not a focus area. And then very suddenly, also with the immigrant crisis, the whole market crashed basically, and volumes were dropping dramatically. So at that time, and I didn't know that myself, but actually buying TextMinded was the beginning of the turnaround of Semantics. So to be completely honest, it was a little bit of culture shock also for me. Both, Danish-Swedish business culture is a bit different. But I realized when I joined Semantics, just a few months later, that I was embarking on something completely different than I had imagined. So what happened 1 month after the closing of the deal? Actually, the CEO left, and they installed a new CEO, my CEO today, Patrick Attermark, and we were basically now tasked with the turnaround of Semantics, turnaround in terms of moving away from the public sector. And also moving towards translation, or what we call language solutions today. So what we did was then we changed that organization in not being country-based in what 2 business areas, interpreting and everything else. And I'm then heading language solutions today.
Everything else. So how do you collaborate, if at all, with interpreting? Is there kind of overlap, or is it mostly like back office functions, finance, stuff like that?
No, there's absolutely very close collaboration. So all the group functions are supporting both business areas. So it's HR and IT and finance, and so is on group level combined, and we also have very close collaboration on technology development and also own resources especially in IT and technology.
Got it. Yeah.
And I think what we're sort of keen to talk about as well is this big deal win with the European Union that I think was announced in December time. But can you tell us a bit about what's involved, services, volumes, languages, etc., a bit of background?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the largest EU contracts that for translation services or language services, and it's called the Single Market Transparency Directive. Which they say is a tool for actually providing information to companies, to basically citizens as well, as how the let's say trade barriers are prevented and so on. So basically, it is a gigantic system of technical regulations for any product, services you might imagine. That needs to be checked whether it also applies to EU legislation. And all of this in the spirit of Europe always needs to be available in all European languages. All data always needs to be democratically available in all languages. So it is basically translation and revision of quite complex, both technical but also legal, sometimes financial matters. It is classified in and that shows the diversity of the content in 13 different domains of, as I said, all kinds of goods and services. And again, not only the complexity of the content, but also the process that these regulations undergo. That is kind of a complete life cycle where it goes from being a draft regulation, then there are all kinds of amendments and comments from different member states until it reaches a final stage of a final regulation that is adopted then by the EU.
So this is for the Commission, right? Not for the...
It's for the European Commission, yes.
For the Commission, right. Okay, before we go into the details of the contract, I want to know more about solutions, etc. But like, how long does it take to respond to one of those monsters of like European RFPs? And who's involved? Like, who do you work with for that?
I work. I mean, I did this mainly together with our partner that I think we come back to, Partner S Team, and I would say the heavy lifting is definitely, especially for this contract, is on the vendor management and vendor recruitment part, because we needed to actually submit names and CVs of around 1,800 translators with specific qualifications. So just the gathering of that information and providing that was a huge undertaking. So from I would say from a workload perspective, that is the biggest part. And then, of course, writing the actual tender, I mean, it were just a few people involved, but that is definitely a very heavy both thinking but also writing part.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
I remember, I don't have much experience of kind of public sector tenders, but what I do remember is that it is super heavy on the CVs and obviously takes a very, very long time. Yeah. But so I think we mentioned as well that we were I know you participated in the tender as part of a consortium. Mm-hmm. So how did you get together with the other two companies? And how are you kind of sharing responsibilities, etc.?
Yeah, so we partner with S-Team, which is a very, actually quite small Swedish technology company, but they have been in NLP and AI for 2 decades almost. And again, more or less, maybe by accident, I met Jochen Hummel, who is known as the founder of Trados originally. And when he sold that to SDL, he joined eventually S-Team and became the CEO of that. And already in 2016, when we were text-minded, we were discussing a big contract for the European Intellectual Property Office, the EUIPO.
I remember that. Isn't that Sevilla or that's Sevilla or Alicante?
Alicante,
that's right. Yeah.
And I mean, this is very interesting because Jochen has been working with the EUIPO as a provider of technology as well. And they have been working with the EU on the technology part for a long time. And now this tender comes out where it is about technology and services. And S-Team is not doing the services part at all. So he said, why shouldn't we combine that? And also being a big believer in the combination of technology and services, that is where real scalability is actually possible. And as you also covered in 2016 or 17, we won that contract. Mm-hmm. And it was a contract not, again, on translation, but actually on revision and editing translations already, and with the use of AI and technology. So ever since, we have been collaborating, and we have also actually a few months after winning that EUIPO deal, this specific tender that we have won now came out, and we said, we could do this together. We applied and we didn't win it at that point. I think today I'm actually quite happy because the magnitude just of the operational side is huge. Not sure if we could have done it at text-minded, but that was the first time that we actually worked very closely together on writing such a tender.
And so what is the technical part or the technology part of the contract, and how is it all going to be integrated into the services?
Yeah, so very high level, you could say we have suggested a solution where, I mean, we're not moving away from the traditional translation part. However, look at this as we do pre-processing and post-processing, obviously, whereas S-Team is doing mainly the pre-processing part. Meaning that we use all the linguistic assets available, that we use their NLP tools to actually provide an output that is, I would say, much better than you would normally say empty output for the translators than to enhance. And that is the whole core of our solution, to deploy technology and AI to actually provide an output that is not only in terms of fluency and quality of the language, but also has annotations towards these domains, as I said, because they are so different. You really need to be extremely careful of also assigning competences. And we use data not only for the actual translation process, we also use data for the matching of the competence. So this is how we have designed a whole workflow based on the data that always travels with the assignments.
So that's interesting that you're saying this. So it's not, quote unquote, just about having an amazing custom MT into whatever 25 languages, but it's also around like the operational side, the workflow, allocating it to the right linguist for post editing. And as you say now with Semantics, obviously it's a big organization, so you can run this at a much bigger scale. Because people tend to, looking from the outside, they tend to think that it's all done with like a great custom engine. But it's not, right? I mean, it's managing all of these different text types, different areas, and then allocating it and payment, etc., is a huge task.
Exactly. I would say that, MT is just a small part of this. So MT is definitely, and we would use like also the eTranslate, but that is a very small part of it. As you said, the real magic that happens is when you actually deploy that into an intelligent workflow where everything, as much as possible, is automated, but always with a human intervention. And given that the nature of the content is, as I said, is very complex, it's technical, but it can also have real life impact on people's lives because it is about legislation. And there are also quite some timelines to respect. So if, for example, a draft regulation is not treated properly by the EU Commission, then a EU member state can basically adopt legislation that is not in line with the EU, right? So it really has real life implications.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, so you haven't started working on the contract quite yet, and it's currently being serviced by another provider. So I'm sure you started prep work, etc., but in terms of it being live, no. So how will it be handed over day one?
You say we're not started yet. We actually have.
You have? Okay.
On Monday morning, it will hit us.
Right.
Normal.
Great time to do a podcast, Britta.
Yeah. So and again, normally you would have like 2-3 months of preparation and handover time. However, due to all kinds of also COVID, that the people of the unit at the commission, they were actually not in the office. So the actual time from signing the contract until they started working with us. So basically, we had 5 weeks. But given that we knew what to do, we then made a project governance and a full program management of this huge implementation project. But not until a few weeks ago, we actually got access to the linguistic assets, everything around processes and access to the database and so on. This has basically happened the last 2 weeks. And as you can imagine, many of our processes are heavily, of course, dependent on the data. And still the quality, the amount, the structure of it, we don't have a full grasp of it yet. From a process workflow perspective, we know how it should work, and now we're assessing the quality of the data. But the commission is extremely helpful and very collaborative. So basically, we have 3-4 times a week we have work meetings with them, and in that sense, it is a good time to do a podcast because we are on track.
Great. Okay. Good to hear.
Good. Well, and so this is one example, or a pretty major example, of a public sector contract, but I know that Semantics obviously also works with private sector clients. So, what's your experience in terms of how those two differ in terms of requirements and solutions and expectations, for example?
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, I mean, 3 years ago, we had interpreting was 75% of our business. Today, language solution is 80% of our business. So we made that complete turnaround already. However, I would say also then the move from public to private has been our main focus. But still having that experience from decades of working with public sector is very valuable. I mean, in general, as we also said, I mean, writing tenders for public is more, you really need to keep formalities. I mean, that is core, and there are requirements that are just, is just yes or no. Whereas obviously private customers, you would have a different approach. You might be able to influence them in discovery meetings, really understand their needs and so on. So from that perspective, going into tender is very different, I would say. And in general, working then with the public versus private, there are also, in many ways, still differences. In general, I think it's fair to say that public is more cautious to adopt technology as well. So it's still very much about the service as such. I think even in Scandinavia, we at least perceive ourselves being very far with digital transformation, but still we can see public sector is a little bit behind. On the other hand, when once a project like this, the EU contract, or other, governmental bodies are actually moving, then obviously the volumes are huge. And from a contractual and maintenance perspective, it's not that heavy lifting, because in some way the expectations and the requirements are much more clear than if you work with an enterprise with numerous stakeholders involved. And once you have set the operational workflow and best practices, it is maintaining, of course, a good delivery and quality, but there's not so much more business development or sales involved.
Got it. And maybe just go back a bit to your story and draw on some of that experience there. I mean, also given that M&A, well, I hesitate to say is heating up again, because it's been hot for like 5 years or something since in this industry. But so you're one of the not rare, but like examples, somewhat rare examples of a founder or business owner who actually stayed on with the company that he sold to. Can you just tell us a bit more about the transition, the process, the thinking process, and why you stayed on? I want to know a bit more about that. The background to that decision.
Yeah, so obviously, as I said, it went very fast, and from my perspective, as I said, both there's always a number, but also, when you go into this, you need to also be willing to let go, because you don't actually know what hits you or what not. However, for me, actually going into that process, it was extremely important that I could still, continue my vision for this industry, and also for the company, and last but not least, also for my people. So I could see that I had reached kind of a level where I wasn't able to grasp everything. We were kind of 80 people or something at that point. And even if you think you are great and doing great stuff, at some time that is limiting for scale. So we could see that all the wonderful ideas that we had, and we were always also driven by having maybe a bit too crazy ideas, but still be executing on them. So we wanted actually that to live further, and the scalability comes with growth and comes with power. So for me, TextMinded also was still my baby, and I would say it was obviously a step to let go of that, freedom of being in charge, right? But when you then actually see that you essentially can become limiting for your own growth and also your people's growth, then I think it's time to do that. And I still think that companies also now in the range of 4 or 5 million euros, if they want to scale and grow, M&A is probably the right way.
Yeah, it's tough to get to that next level. Like from the
it is.
There's, I think there's like a 4 to 5 million level, and there's like a maybe 20 to 30 million roughly, and then there's the big boy stuff, right? But it sounds like to me that also there wasn't enormous amounts of control descending upon you once you joined Semantics, right? Because I mean, there's other like, you know, I got some experience with like American selling to an American company. There's a there's a fair amount of control coming down there, but it seems like Semantics.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was also one of my choices, was actually to sell to, let's say, a Nordic company, because we share some not only values, but also, I mean, business as such, the culture as such. We are very flat, organized and so on. And as I said in the beginning, we got a new CEO immediately, not from the industry. So I'm blessed with a CEO that really trusted me as well, and today I can say, I mean, I have the freedom of being in charge, and at the same time very, very supported. And that was for me also one of the best experiences in joining Semantics, also on the C-level, is, suddenly I have a great team of professionals around me who are actually smarter than I. And I think that is a learning that you really appreciate, and you don't necessarily know that when you are, your own CEO.
Got it.
And you mentioned there a little bit about, obviously the numbers need to be right, but also getting a people fit, a culture fit, maybe also a geographical fit. I mean, what kind of general advice do you have for LSP owners that might be considering an exit or a sale? Are there any do's and don'ts that you can think of?
Again, I think when you are an owner of a smaller, or you're an entrepreneur yourself, you really need to, as I said, make up your mind. Is there something, more? Is there a vision you want to carry on? And how important is it that your people can also be in that new company? So these were, the integrity of what TextMinded was very important to me, and I could see that not only live further in Semantics, but actually develop further. So in that sense, I think it's a very personal decision. But at the same time, also, no matter how emotional that is for you or personal, you need to be able to let go and willing to let go, and also at some point say, yeah, there might be taken some decisions that I would not take. And even Semantics will also be, sold to someone else at some point, obviously, and something that I will not be in charge of, but still keeping the vision in mind.
Got it. Hey, so let's do a bit of crystal ball gazing here. Seems like the language industry has gotten through COVID, not unscathed, but quite well compared to many other industries, and I think we're blessed for that. How is business going right now, 2021? What do you think? What's your outlook for like the remainder of the year, generally?
Yeah, so we at Semantics, and also my business area of language solutions, we actually had an extraordinary 2020. We had quite ambitious budget in going into 2020, and we almost reached those budgets. But the best thing of it is that we actually significantly improved our profits. At the same time, in this transformation that we were still in, also executing all the strategic initiatives. And that is, I think, almost the biggest achievement, that the people who have been really working so hard day and night, and that we at the same time not, lost focus on what we need to achieve in terms of also, I mean, the way that semantics is not only consolidating but also integrating. And we have this clear, we want to integrate completely also in systems and culture and so on. So we succeeded with that as well. And now heading into 21, both with this contract, which was a nice Christmas present, obviously, but already trading on our budgeted level, and I think it goes, as you said, for the majority of our peers in the market, that I think we have a bright future.
That's a great note to leave it on. And of course, I guess a bit of the savings were from not going to conferences. So I don't know. Let's see. Maybe in the second half,
travel budgets. I mean, I usually spend 2-3 days a week in Stockholm. And I have been there once, I think, since during the last year.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, hopefully we can catch up in the second half of 2021. Some smaller conference maybe that we're trying to pull off somewhere in Europe. Let's see.
Looking forward to that.
Great. All right, Britta, that was fantastic. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, and have a great day.